Good evening. I'll call to order the Arvada City Council workshop for May 22nd, 2023. Kristen Rush, if you'll do the roll call.
Mayor Williams.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Jones.
Here.
Councilmember Pfeiffer.
Here.
Councilmember Marriott.
Here.
Councilmember Mormon. Councilmember Simpson.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Mr. Pfeiffer.
I'd like to make a motion to excuse Councilmember Mormon from tonight's workshop.
All votes cast. That passes 6-0. Mr. Mormon is excused. We have a workshop presentation tonight on Colorado Proposition 123. Who's going to lead that discussion? Ryan, you got that?
I got it. Good evening, Mayor and City Council. Thanks so much for having us. I said I got it, but the reality is Sam Bradley's got it. Sam is our new housing development specialist, and she was hired in part at City Council's direction in order to support more efforts towards affordable housing. And so, as you know, we've seated an affordable housing committee or a housing committee. Their first meeting is on Wednesday night. It's going to be in CCR, I think. And you're all welcome to attend. I know Lisa will be there, or I think you're going to be there on Zoom. Yeah, but anyway, she'll be there. But ahead of that, we're going to talk about Prop 123, and I just wanted to kind of give a quick overview. So tonight we're going to talk about what is Prop 123, where did it come from? It was a voter-approved initiative. We'll talk a little bit about the details. We'll learn a little bit about how the funds can be used. We'll talk about whether or not Arvada should commit to it and what that means. And if we do commit to it and don't perform, what are the associated penalties? We are still early on in the process, so we're going to talk about some unresolved questions, and then we're going to talk about some deadlines and timelines. So as I mentioned, Sam Bradley, she's our new housing development specialist. She's going to lead us through kind of the meat of it. I'm going to jump in with some of the opt-in or Arvada's commitment related things. And then Carrie Espinoza, as you all know, our executive director of the Housing Authority, is also here to be able to fill in the blanks and add some additional information as well. So I'll turn it over to Sam. Thank you. You know how to use this? Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, Sam, and welcome aboard.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So let's learn a little bit about Prop 123, right? All right, so where did it come from? So this was legislation that was approved in 2022. Now 1/10 of 1% or 0.1% of all state income tax revenue is going to be quartered off and put into a state affordable housing fund. So this is going to be a fund that is governed within the state treasury. And the purpose of this fund was really to start supporting rental housing initiatives for families in Colorado earning less than 60% of area median income. That's usually the typical definition of what an affordable rental unit is. That's the LIHTC cap. And also to help provide some affordable home ownership opportunities for those earning less than 120% area median income. So a little bit higher, which you can expect, for homeowners. So this fund, which is already sort of portioned off, is then split again into two parts. There is the financing fund, which is going to account for 60% of the total fund, and then there is the housing support fund, which is going to be 40%. So these funding cycles are going to be a 3-year cycle. So when we will get a little into it a little bit later, but sort of if we are going to sort of opt into this legislation, it will be a 3-year commitment. So what are some of the mechanics? So this is all kind of basic right now, but as of right now, we have our opt-in date, which is going to be November 1st of 2023. But what does opting in really mean? So the way this fund works is it's going to be a 2-step process to get money out of the fund. So the first step would be a municipality like Arvada choosing to opt in. That's saying, yes, we want access to the fund. Saying yes does not issue funding. What it does is it gives applicants, local governments, nonprofits, land trusts, private developers, the ability to ask for distributions from the fund, so to apply to get funds out of the fund, to use to support projects that are taking place within Arvada. So saying yes, it comes with all of the obligations, but it does not necessarily guarantee funding, but it does open up the possibility that these developers and, parties involved could ask for the funds. If you do not opt in, you say no, then this entire source of funding would be closed to anybody looking to support housing initiatives in Arvada using the funds from this. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. So it's going to...
Excuse me, can I ask a clarifying question on that?
Sure.
So are you saying that if the city government opts out, says we're not in,
Yes.
that a nonprofit that wants to do something with housing in Arvada is told, no, you can't get anything either because the local government didn't opt in?
Correct. They will not be able to apply for distributions from the Prop 123 or the State Affordable Housing Fund.
To do a project in Arvada, but if they're a nonprofit that operates in multiple jurisdictions, they can apply, but they'd have to use it somewhere else.
So long as that jurisdiction opted in.
Right, okay, thank
Okay.
you.
All right, so what are the obligations? So when you opt in, you are, as a city, as a municipality, you are automatically agreeing to increase your affordable housing stock by a certain amount. That's going to be a slide a little bit later. You are also agreeing to develop a fast-track permit approval process. So something the state does not want is they do not want to give distributions to funds that distributions to projects that are then going to sort of sit. They want this money to be very fast-moving, very mobile. So they want the municipality, as a part of opting in, you are agreeing to create this 90-day fast-track approval process. How is the fund governed? Well, that's not super clear. They have identified some priorities such as high density, mixed income. They seem to favor rental a little bit over home ownership. Environmental sustainability is a great thing, but really these distributions are going to be made at the discretion of a state-selected administrator. All right, so what can we use the fund for? So as I mentioned before, the fund is being split into two separate parts. The first is the Affordable Housing Financing Fund. So this fund is really for brick and mortar building housing, right? So we're looking at land banking, we're looking at equity investments in affordable housing for a tenant equity vehicle. We're looking at below market financing, some gap debt financing. There is a little bit of a favoritism towards LIHTC projects at this time. Also, there's a lot of interest in modular and sort of like factory built housing. Then there's the other 40% of the fund, which is used, think of it more as like a service fund as opposed to a brick and mortar housing fund. So this is going to be in the form of cash payments for down payment assistance. This is going to be assistance for mobile home purchases. This could be vouchers for support for the homeless population. And there is also grant funding for the local planning development in the city. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I just walk around. All right, so the next, I actually think, is this one you?
Yep.
You want to talk about the commitments?
I do. All right, so this is me again, and I'm just going to move you along just so you're there. So commitments. So the city of Arvada really has two commitments if they chose to opt in. And the first one is that we need to increase our affordable housing units by 3% a year over 3 years in order to meet the requirements obligations. We're going to talk a little bit about that in numbers in the next slide, but generally speaking, I think that we've all heard that and are aware of that. And what does that mean in actual numbers? We'll get to that in a second. But the other thing that I really wanted to talk about is the city agrees to create a streamlined permitting process where the decision rendered 90 days or less after a development submits an application. So there's a lot of language in there that is not well defined at this time. submits an application, what is an application, what is a decision, those types of things. I will tell you that there is a group of community development professionals, planners, and those types of things that are trying to navigate this and understand that. On its face, if we just took our normal process today and went from beginning to end and said 100% approval, our process would be well outside the 90 days, and I can explain a little bit of why that is. But given the fact that affordable housing projects at times may be a little bit more controversial, at times you're going to want to do neighborhood outreach, you're going to have communication, and so some of the things that takes longer through a public process is making sure that the community is well informed and that they're integrated into that process. Well, a lot of the questions that come up during these hearings, as you all well know, are things like traffic and drainage and what does the building look like and all of those things. And once you have those conversations, which are important conversations, they take longer. There's feedback loops, there's folks that make modifications based on what they're hearing, all of those things. So it's an incredibly hard process to not just do a entitlement process that has people talking about it, but all the engineering, all the planning, all the studies that go along with it. So the thing that we are considering, and this will be subject to City Council approval, is similar to what we have now as a conditional use permit. We would be looking at something like a affordable housing conditional use permit, where we would identify the piece of land, we would do a conceptual drawing, and City Council, similar to how they do a conditional use permit now, would say, yes, it's appropriate to have affordable housing at that location, at that density, in that area. And then the application at that point would be, if City Council approved it, it would be deemed approved, and then it would go into the site planning process where all the engineering and those types of things, so that we kind of got that clock off of our back and was able to move forward in an appropriate way. Now, what this does is a couple things. It allows for the community to be involved during the first 90-day process to say thumbs up or thumbs down relative to affordable housing at that location. And then it gives council the ability to weigh in on that as well. But it doesn't get into all those engineering details that would take a longer period of time. One of the things, though, to consider is that in a 90-day process where there's public hearings and it going to planning commission and city council, 45 of those days are just the notice requirements that you have to meet in order to get there. So we really only have one, maybe two reviews to be able to look at this from a conceptual standpoint, do neighborhood meetings, get feedback, and get that from council. The other thing that you need to consider, that after the 90 days and you guys render a decision on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, after that, we do the site plan. Well, a site plan is something that can be administratively approved, but then called up by city council. If you were doing an affordable housing conditional use permit, you would lose the ability to be able to call up something at the site plan, because the direction from the state language says that you need to render a final decision on that product before you at the end of the 90 days. And that would mean that you couldn't make a different decision at the end of the site planning process that you already made at the affordable housing. So at the end of the 90 days, when we were going through the affordable housing conditional use, you would either have to put conditions on that conditional use at that time that the developer would have to follow, or you could say, but it has to meet our development code and you can't ask for any major modifications, minor modifications, all of those things that would mean that a final decision hadn't been made. So I explained a lot. It's very complicated. I'll pause for questions.
Mr. Fiver.
So I know this is a commitment on the opt-in, but where in the stage would the funding be approved? So would this product, let's say proposal came in front of us through the 90 days, do they know they have the money, or it doesn't matter what it is? It doesn't matter if they get money out of this fund or
Yeah,
not?
the
We have to
two
go
things
through
are kind of mutually exclusive.
Okay.
So you're applying and competing for the money, and that's one bucket. And then the city is doing the 90-day process for anybody, whether they get money or not.
Through
So
this.
if they declare themselves an affordable housing project, then we need to meet that requirement through some mechanism in order to do the 90 days. And the money is mutually exclusive.
from it. So it just means that anyone doing an affordable housing proposal will get to go through this streamlined process.
Yes, but keep in mind of what streamline means from a practical standpoint. It means that they come in, they do a pre-application with the meeting, they declare themselves an affordable housing project. They have a location and those types of things. We host a neighborhood meeting, we get some feedback, then they do an application. When they hit that application, that's the 90 days that we start reviewing. But we're not going to be reviewing it in all the same details that we do a site plan. We're doing it similar to what we would do for a conceptual plan of this is generally what it is. But remember, in our conditional use, we have certain criteria that it needs to be substantially similar to what was presented as the conceptual plan, parking, heights, number of buildings, those types of things. So we would review it in that same context. And then if City Council approved that, then they would have the ability to administratively approve that without the City Council being able to call that up at the end.
So there's risk in that process.
Yes.
So I think for me to feel comfortable with this conversation is to have a risk assessment of like, what am I giving up for this process? Like, because if I see it as a concept plan and a lot of it's going to be administratively approved, there could be a lot of issues in that. And what I would consider, there could be some issues. I can't call up. I can't, right? I lose.
You lose the ability to call up.
I lose my ability as a council member to represent my community a little bit. So I would like to understand like what those true risks would be and what would I be giving up to opt into this program that may or may not benefit my community.
Yeah, and so, fair enough. I would say that the risk is similar to what we have from a building standpoint. So like what is the design? I would say that the risk is similar to today, in which you have a conditional use going into a mixed use, in which you provide a conditional use and then that they're required to be substantially similar to what was presented to you. So city staff will need to make sure that they're within whatever guide rails council gives them at that approval.
Yeah,
And
the substantially, similar, I think, is in the eye of the beholder. So I think we would need to really define that a little bit more in that area if we were to go down that path. Just because, and then also, like you said, no modification, no minor modifications or whatever, they would have to waive all that right through this process.
That is correct, because they need to be 100% approved, and you can't guarantee that a minor or major modification is going to be approved. There needs to be justification and all those other things. So they need to follow the development code as written in order to meet that. I would say the other part of that risk equation is that if we don't opt in and we don't provide this, then the city's at risk of not being able to access the funding. So that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, I'd just like to know the risks. Like, I mean, I feel that this could pull some levers that council will not have anymore away from us, and I just want to understand what they are.
Yeah.
I'm just, obviously we're just hearing this tonight.
Absolutely.
So what I would like to hear in the future conversations is what are those risks?
One of the things that we can put in the weekly memo this Friday is when we define substantially similar in the code for the conditional use, we would use substantially similar language to that. Sorry, I had to. And so we can put that language that's already kind of defined in there, and we can revisit that, not to say you have to say this is the right or not, but just what we're using now as that bar for that language.
Yep.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Ms. Simpson.
Thank you, Ryan. So if we're getting to a couple of these later in the presentation, feel free to say so. But my first question is, what is the 3% target for Arvada specifically? Because we already have a considerable amount of housing density.
Yeah, so great question. And I will tell you that that answer is a little bit fluid. So I changed the slide because we're going to get into that conversation. And how you define the baseline is something that I still think that we're working on with Dole and the Department of Housing to understand it. Because you can see the baseline calculations at top, and so there's different calculations of how you calculate it for rental versus home ownership and those types of things. Those numbers are there. But the thing that's more interesting is the stuff at the bottom where it starts talking about which AMI, area median income, are you using. Because if you use Arvada's AMI, then that necessarily means that we have more affordable housing because our AMI is higher than the state. If we use the state's AMI, there is lower, and therefore not as much of our housing qualifies as affordable housing. Now here's the real kicker that's super interesting, and Sam can correct me if I'm wrong. How many moths are going to be under that cup by the end? We got 2 so far? Okay, we're going, moving. Yeah, good. So here's the interesting thing. When you opt in and you say, okay, we have X amount of affordable housing units and we need Y more in order to meet our 3%. If we use the state's, or if we use Jefferson County and Arvada's number, then our baseline number of units right now is 6,850. Approximately, which means we need about 615 over the next 3 years. The good news is that we have a lot in the pipeline, and I'm going to talk about what it means of when they actually start counting. We'll talk about that here in a second. You can do that. However, if you used the state's median income, then we only have 2,000 affordable units, and we only have to get 184. So number one, which one is it? Number two is, let's say we use the state's median income to say that we only have 2,000 units. However, we're building affordable housing at 60% AMI for Arvada's AMI, which is over the state's AMI, but below ours. It means that we're qualifying things at a different AMI, which means we can count more than what the state would count. I don't know if that makes sense. It sort of doesn't, but those are the types of things that are right now a little bit fluid, and that the state is open to mixing and matching AMIs in order to meet their need. I think their priority is getting money out and having projects be done, and that they'll count later after they kind of see how things work. But right now we don't have a lot of language of understanding how specifically they want to count. And the language that we've been receiving so far is that they're open to a mix and match approach, which gives a lot of flexibility for us to be able to meet that 3% annual relatively easy.
Okay, great. Because my follow-up question was going to be if we would be able to apply projects we've already approved but maybe haven't already received LIHTC funding, if those would now be eligible.
So that's a great question, and that's on this slide too. And so it's permitted units between January 1st, 2024 and December 31st, 2026. So it means that they have to get their permit. So when you approved Marshall Point, thank you, sorry, 260s. Now that's been approved, but it's still going through a site plan process, and it's not been permitted yet, meaning they don't have a building permit. So all 260 of those, assuming that it gets its permit after January 1st, would count towards this. However, for example, Vance Street Flats, which is under construction in Old Town right now on the north side of Ralston Road, its 50 units would not count because it's already got permits. So George Thorne's project by the Walmart would not qualify because it's got its permit. But the Family Tree, assuming it gets its building permits after it, would apply. So there's a number of things that are in the pipeline that, depending on when they actually get their permits or when it's going to count. So hopefully that answers your question.
And it does. Thank you very much. And then I guess my last question is, I realize this is an unlikely scenario, but what happens in this community or any other if they don't reach the 3%? Perhaps there's just not interest in building there, or there's not space to build there. What happens to a community if they don't hit the 3% after opting in?
That is Sam's next slide. See, you're just
There we
a
go.
fortune teller, and you're one step ahead of us.
Before we go there, let's see what Mr. Marriott has.
Yes, please.
Could you go back one slide?
Yes.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. When you talk about a 90-day potential conditional use permit process for subsidized housing, is the same process available to somebody who's just building something market rate?
So at this time, not at this time. We need to think through that and kind of understand it to kind of flush all this out. What I will tell you is that we don't have to have that 90-day process flushed out until November 1st, 2026. So when you opt in, you have 3 years to come up with the 90-day plan, and you don't have to do the 90-day plan during the first 3 years of the project. So what I will tell you is that we've spent a lot of time really thinking about what mechanism could be used at all. But we really haven't flushed this out well beyond that and talking about the unintended consequences, how other things are impacted, and quite frankly, whether or not the state would agree with us defining all the terms in their definition the same way. So that needs to go forward. I understand the point in kind of asking that to see whether or not you could get a thumbs up or a thumbs down on any project within 90 days and then do the site plan process after that. Maybe we could certainly do that. It's important to keep in mind that the time period of review is going to be approximately the same and maybe even a little bit shorter if you didn't do this, but we're looking for a mechanism that kind of guarantees that affordable housing can be built within a 90-day period. The other process allows for the call-up and those types of things. It's actually could be a shorter period of time because you don't have to put 90 days in front of it.
Okay. So tell me about what's the typical process. Let's say I come to you and I've got 2 acres and I want to build multifamily housing on it, and I'm not going to have it subsidized. I'm just going to build market rate housing. And my assumption is I show up with some materials and we have a pre-application meeting and we talk about it, and then I show up with refined and complete materials to make an application. Yep. Okay. So tell me what happens from there.
Yeah, perfect. So our target process is a 20-week process, roughly 120 days, that has all approvals administratively completed at the end of the 120 days, not including the call-up provision. So what that entails is 2 4-week reviews by the city of Arvada and 1 2-week review, which we call a decision review. So somebody submits something to us after they do a neighborhood meeting, we review it for 4 weeks. The first 4 weeks is usually the most complicated because you've got all the drainage, traffic, studies, all the most complicated things, and you haven't seen this before. So that takes the most detail. You provide comments, it goes back, they have 4 weeks to respond, back and forth, ping pong, 4 weeks us, 4 weeks them, and so on. And then we try to get to, everything is getting cleaned up during that 3rd review, which we call decision review, which is the 2-week review. And if everything's all good, we'll sign off on it. And then at this point in time, it goes to City Council for their awareness. And if they want to call it up, they have the 17 days to do that. And then if they don't call it up, then it's officially approved. So that's the process in an ideal circumstance. I will tell you that...
Hang on a second, let me just make sure I'm clear.
Yeah.
So the city review part of that's 120 days, and then the call-up is 30 days or something like that?
17.
Or 17 days after that, okay. If it's a project that requires a conditional use, like in a MX zoning or something else, a major modification, a minor modification, something else, where does that fit into that process and how much time does that add?
So we try to do that concurrently to the best of our ability. And so usually that site planning process is going on at the same time. So it shouldn't add a lot of time because major modifications and conditional use permits, you're only reviewing kind of a narrow part of the overall plan. So we should be able to write a staff report relative to that subject while we're doing the regular site plan process. However, there are cases in which you got to a second review and they're like, well, we just can't make that work. And so now we're adding a major modification on at the end or some other condition. So through the iterative process, sometimes new processes come along as part of the compromise. Okay. So in an ideal world, we'd love to do everything within that 120 days. Now, it's a little bit different if you're doing an annexation or a rezoning.
That was going to be my next question. If you have to rezone,
yeah,
where or a comprehensive plan amendment or rezoning or an annexation, where does that fit in?
So this is good questions. I like all of these questions. That also, that's slightly different. So when you're talking about a rezoning, you're really only asking the question is this an appropriate place to have this zoned? So it's not like a PUD. It's not like you have all that site plan and all those things with you. You're really only asking that fundamental, simple question. However, historically, during rezonings and comprehensive plan amendments and those types of things, City Council has felt more comfortable having a better understanding of why am I rezoning to it and what's going to happen once I do this rezoning. So oftentimes, those processes take a little bit longer, not because they're required to have a site plan and those types of things during rezoning, but it's usually in the client's or the customer's best interest to have that so that City Council can have a bigger picture of understanding what's going on. To be perfectly frank, a good example of this is the Amazon project, where it was asking for a rezoning and an annexation. And really the site plan and the parking and many of those other things were not a requirement at all to the applicant in order to be able to move forward. However, given the nature of that project and how transformative it was going to be in that location, it was in the applicant's best interest and in City Council's best interest to fully understand what they were talking about before they moved forward with that annexation. We have another one that you guys are going to see, I think it's on July 10th, which is a rezoning from PUD to CG, General Commercial, up in Candelas. That's going to be talking about a daycare. A little bit more simple and straightforward than the Amazon, but another example of that.
So the question I have then is with the requirements of 1, 2, 3, is it intimating the developer can come with a parcel and say, I need this annexed, rezoned, and approved in 90 days, that we're committing to do all of that in 90 days?
Yeah, so let me think back, because we talked about that question with our larger group. And I think what we're trying to do is parse out just the affordable housing piece and leave everything else up to an administrative process. Now, you can't do that with annexation and rezoning. And so I believe that those things would need to come along all at the same time with a conceptual plan, a rezoning, and a comp plan amendment if they were to choose to do that. But from a staff perspective, if we're only asking the question of whether it should be zoned this way or that way, that's not a heavy review on this. That's a policy question. And we can give you the context of what the comp plan says and all those other things. It's not really getting into the site plan that makes it a lot harder for us to review it in that time frame.
So I guess I maybe didn't clearly understand
sorry.
your answer. My fear is, just let me let you know, my fear is that we will have developers approach us and say, I have an option on this property here. Here's my application. I expect to have approval in 90 days, and it may include features like annexation potentially, or comp plan amendment potentially, or rezoning potentially.
Yep.
In addition to this process by which they get a up or down, within 90 days.
Yeah.
And that we would be committing to, that in other words, we would be giving up the control of those processes because we have to do it in, their expectation is that this gets done in 90 days. In other words, it's kind of this assumption that it's not a question about whether you would get this rezoned. We're getting it rezoned because of what we're asking for, and we're getting it in 90 days.
Well, city council has the right to turn it down. They don't have any obligation to approve this at the end of the hearing. So if somebody came to you and says, I want annexation, rezoning, and here's the conceptual drawing of what I'm doing, and I want affordable housing conditional use, and you say, you know what, I don't feel comfortable with that, we're not doing it. So that's one option. The other option is, let's say the developer has the ability to opt out of the 90-day process. So they have the ability to say, I'm reading the tea leaves, and I feel like I need to do more homework, and I need to do more community outreach, and I need to have more conversations to understand what's in the best interest of the community in order to do that, and it's going to take me longer than 90 days. So I would rather take a longer period of time and do that slightly differently than to try to make this 90-day window, because I may be at risk of not providing enough detail or information to get city council's support.
Right. So if the developer opts out of the 90-day time frame, there's no effect on funding or anything like that?
No. We're like that's on them to decide that.
Okay. Last thing on this particular point, and that's as this is presented to us, we're required to give an up or down within 90 days. Well, what if the developer brings you something that's insufficient for the administrative process to be successful, and it pushes it past 90 days? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, so one of the words that's not in here but is in the law is a complete application. So some of that needs to be defined, because we talk about completeness checks all the time, and so somebody can give us a traffic study, for example, but maybe it doesn't meet our needs because a certain intersection isn't in there. Like the counts were not done according to what our traffic engineer wanted or whatever. Is that a complete application or not? It wasn't satisfactory to us for us to be able to do our review in order to understand it. So again, there's some rulemaking, there's some understanding, there's some nuance to this, that it's getting through those next 3 years where we're defining this process and going through the rulemaking, because I think everybody has the same question of what is a complete application. And we can't really be, if somebody brings us stuff that we can't review and we have no idea whether or not this is going to work or not, we can't be beholden to a 90-day process without the accurate information in front of us. So that's some of the things that need to be defined, but we're on top of understanding of what that means to us in order to be able to push back on the word complete.
Yeah, I guess my question just is within the process, you talked about there's a 4-week first review, and then it goes back and they have 4 weeks to respond, and then it goes back, and there's, this ping pong back and forth. But at any space along the way, there's potential for the applicant to not satisfy a comment or a restriction or whatever sufficiently.
Yes.
And so it requires another back and forth. What happens if that pushes it outside the 90 days? I mean, the city didn't render them a decision within 90 days.
So what we would do, like from a staff, we would have an automatic time frame, right? And we would probably say, we want to get 2 reviews, 4-week reviews probably won't work for us just given the time frame. So maybe we do 2 3-week reviews. But maybe at the end, we say there's insufficient information here. They believe that it's complete. Staff doesn't believe so. We're recommending denial because we don't feel like we've been able to fully understand what this project is and what the impact is to the community. So staff also, we don't have to recommend approval on anything. What we want to do is just give council the information of whether or not our analysis says that the things that we've reviewed conforms with the code, and that's the only judgment that we're making, yes or no. And if we feel at the end of whatever our review process, and if there's a ticking clock that gets us to that, then at the end of that review process, we're gonna say, well, it's time to do notices so we can make this 90 days, and we have the information that we have, that's the information that's going to the public, and we're gonna make a recommendation based on that.
Right, okay. And do we know how that would affect a situation like that where someone were to not be rendered a decision in 90 days because of, whatever the back and forth or their insufficiency or whatever? What does that do to us in the 1, 2, 3 calculation as far as accepting the funds or not being able to accept the funds?
Well, are you talking about whether or not we're gonna make our 3% because we didn't approve enough?
Not necessarily that, although I would have a question about that, but
How many more questions do you have?
I'm just about done. We're committing to a 90-day process, right?
Yes.
So if our 90-day process doesn't yield a decision at the end of 90 days, are we in violation of our agreement, our commitment to this Prop 123?
Well, there's a couple things, and there's a bunch of hypotheticals in there, but one of them is let's say that we're getting ready to go to Planning Commission, and the city staff is recommending denial because we're saying we don't have enough complete information. It may behoove the developer to say, I don't want to do the 90 days anymore because I want to make sure, I
want to get there.
I would rather have a staff recommendation supporting this than not supporting it.
Okay.
So I think the developer gets in a position where they need to make some decisions about how serious they are about being able to do this, because we will get to a decision.
Yeah, I just worry that the 90 days, that we end up in a position where we have to approve it in 90 days, not that we get to make decisions with the process along the way like we normally do. But I think you've answered that. So,
Okay.
So that's good. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Simpson?
Thank you. I actually had some questions about land banking. We can go back.
All right. Oh, I guess I'm doing that.
Perfect. So we see Affordable Housing Financing Fund under land banking, but there's no details on what this entails. Is this specifically government land banking? Is it developer land banking? Is it anybody who's interested in land banking?
So Sam, do you want to, yeah, Sam's she's smarter than I am.
No, I'm just obsessed with land banking. All right, so there are a couple parties who can land bank. The parties are local governments can land bank, and if you land bank, it would be as a grant and not a loan. But also nonprofit developers can apply for funding for acquisition purposes for land banking. That loan would be forgivable upon upon their permits being approved. So let's say I'm ABC nonprofit developer, I buy a piece of land, I want to build affordable housing on it, and I use Prop 123 financing to purchase the land. That starts a clock. I need to submit a plan to the municipality within 5 years to show you what I want to do, what I'm going to build there, and I need to be permitted within 10. If I am not permitted within 10 years to build housing, affordable housing on the land that I bought using Prop 123 funding, I have a couple of options. One, I can pay back the loan with interest, and then that property is going to become mine to do with whatever I want to. Or I can grant or give the land to the city of Arvada, the local municipality, and then that loan would be forgiven, and then the land would come into the possession of the city.
Fantastic, thank you. And with the grant, has DOLA determined will it be a % of the land value? And like, for instance, is it a 50-50 match? For those watching at home, the moths in here are terrible tonight. I swear we're not spastic up here. But would it be a 50-50% match? Is it 100%?
It has not yet been defined. So the only thing that's really been defined is how much of the Affordable Housing Financing Fund will be going towards land banking grants. So it could be up to 100% for all we know at this particular point in time. I did ask the question of, you know, how many grants the city or developers within the city would be able to grab, because I was a little concerned that there wouldn't be a ton of control on the land banking. And from what it seems like, they seem to be leaning towards a municipality will probably have one land banking grant or loan approved per funding cycle, so per year.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Do we know if, for instance, to Mr. Marriott's discussion about annexation, other things, do we know if land banking would necessarily have to come with water rights, as we often require?
That we do not know. That's not written in there.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess my kind of last idea here is land banking. So there's a new approach approving where the city maybe retains the land, but then people can develop on it and they can own the structures, but not the land underneath, as a way of keeping it more affordable. Is this more to get at that idea, or is it that we can bank the land and then when we have a project we approve of, we can turn around and sell it at a discount, et cetera?
So I think it is for the development of perpetual affordable housing. The way they're crafting this legislation is they seem to want a lot of municipalities to get to yes. So they're offering a lot of incentives. There are not a ton of rules surrounding certain aspects of the legislation, which is something that Carrie and I will be pestering them about until we get to the point where we need to make a decision, because there are ways in which, you know, you may be able to use some of this money and some of these regulations in a way that maybe the city doesn't want. But as of right now, the land is for the development of affordable housing. And the way affordable housing, at least in Colorado and frankly most of the country, works right now is it's really hard to develop without LIHTC. And LIHTC comes with a natural compliance period, a natural affordability restriction on the property itself for at least 15 years. A lot of these LIHTC projects end up remaining affordable in perpetuity because by the time you get to the end of the 15 years, you will likely need to refinance and resyndicate, which is just going to restart that cycle and throw another 15 years of compliance on it. So generally speaking, when you build affordable housing, it is difficult to transition it into market rate housing or try to sell it off. So I think, and this land banking is exclusively to build affordable housing. It's not to build market rate housing. And it's affordable in the sense that that 60% AMI limit. So I think it would be really, I haven't seen legislation that is going to expressly prohibit it, but I think just the logistics of it, it's gonna be really difficult to do, especially when you consider the fact that, you know, you have 10 years, you have to get it permitted. It's gonna be permitted for affordable housing. So if you wanted to transition it to something else, and you have to deal with getting it rezoned, which then the city council could step in.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think you can now proceed.
Sure. All right, we did the slide, Okay, so the fun part, what are the penalties for the city? So as they crafted this legislation, as I mentioned before, really they want to get, the state wants to get to yes. They want to get to yes, so they don't want to create too many barriers to entry, and they certainly don't want to scare anybody off. So first is not opting in. So if the city chooses not to opt in, it just will not have access to that state affordable housing fund. So developers, the city itself, you're not going to be able to apply for those funds. You can opt in at a later date. So every November, there's kind of a re-up. So let's say you didn't feel ready in 2023, you could opt in 2024. And then you'd be able to start applying for the remaining 2 years of the 3-year funding cycle. If you needed one more year, then you could opt in 2025, and you would be able to apply for funding in the last year of that funding cycle. And the affordable housing increase target would be reduced by 3%. Respectively. So let's say you didn't want to opt in 2023, you opted in 2024, you would only need to grow by 6% and not 9%. And then at the end of 2026, or at the end of 2026, November 2026, you'd be opting in for the next funding cycle, which would be 3 years. So once you opt in, you're in, at whatever junction, you're in for the 3 years, or the 2 or whatever is remaining left. So the real only penalty to not opting in this year is that you will miss out on the ability to apply for funding for the year of 2024. So you'd miss 1 out of the 3 years. So the next question is, what are the penalties if we do not hit our affordable housing funding target? They're very low. There is no clawbacks on funds that have been distributed. There's no plans to introduce clawbacks. But what they will do is, for that first year of the next 3-year funding cycle, you will not be allowed to opt in. So if you wanted to opt in again for the next 3-year funding cycle, you'd have to opt in year 2 instead of year 1. So essentially your ability to apply to the Prop 123 fund, the Affordable State Housing Fund, it would be frozen for about a year. But as of right now, that is the only penalty they are thinking of enforcing. So of course, we still have some unresolved questions. The first is that these programs are not fully developed. They are crafting them to get to yes, but there are a lot of developers, a lot of municipalities, a lot of housing authorities that have a lot of questions on how this money can be used, what are the consequences, and we are working with them. We're in communication with DOLA and CHAFA to really understand the answers to these questions. They just don't have them yet, which is why we don't have them to present to you today. A really big one for the city of Arvada, because your area median income is so much higher than some of the surrounding area median incomes, is can we actually mix and match the baseline against what we're going to count as affordable housing when we count up those permits issued in December of 2026. From the representative I spoke to said that he was leaning yes in that one, so hopefully that's good news, but we do not have a definitive answer for that yet. And then we also have a preservation question that we have in, which they don't know, and that is, there are some units in the city that are what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, simply because it's an older property, the landlord never really bothered raising the rent, so we have these properties that are affordable base if you look solely at their rent, but they're not under any kind of restriction. If we rehabbed them and threw a restriction on them, could we count them as new units? So that's another question we're kind of working through. And so now we have our timelines. November 1st, 2023, if that would ensure that we would get all 3 years of the funding cycle. We could opt in later, just, you'd be cutting 1 to 2 years off, depending. And the time that we're going to have to increase the affordable housing stock is just permitting projects starting in January of 2024 and ending in December of 2026. So it is 3 calendar years. And that's it. Do you have any other questions?
Mr. Marriott is going to keep us here for another 2 hours.
Just another minute. I just had a question. You brought up Arvada's AMI. What is it?
So AMI is 94? Yeah. So it's, area median income, 94, I actually.
Is 94,000 in Arvada. So 60% of that is whatever, 58,000 or something like that, or 52,000. Okay. And then I think you probably explained it on the slide, but this is maybe a comment as much as anything. We don't actually build or develop any housing, subsidized or otherwise. So whether we make these targets or not is completely out of our hands. Like, we don't have any ability to achieve these targets or not achieve these targets. We're at the will of the market, and particularly some of the subsidized housing projects that we get here in Arvada are in line waiting for LIHTC. You mentioned the Marshall Point thing. I believe they haven't even been awarded LIHTC or not. So luckily, it looks like the penalties are small. There's not really any risk. So we don't have to worry about that, but it seems like an incongruous thing there where we're responsible for something that we have absolutely zero control over. So anyway, that's not a question, that's just kind of a comment about one of the things I see as kind of a odd feature of this odd proposal.
So I don't see you as not having control. I see you as not having direct control. I think a big part of this is going to be, you don't need to encourage development in Arvada. And affordable housing development is very hot right now. You have that G line going straight through. You're 20 minutes away from Denver. I think it's going to be more along the lines of, if you can show developers that this is a place where they can come in and develop their projects and they're not going to be stonewalled, we don't want affordable housing here. I think that's all you really need to do. And it's based on your location and how hot the market is right now. If you were out in a rural county, I would say, yeah, it's going to be hard. Maybe you do need to engage in some self-developers, but I really don't see that you would need to. As we mentioned, we have several affordable housing developers who are very interested in developing right now. You'd already hit your baseline, you'd already hit your targets.
But I would say that's taken a long time to get those here. It's not as hot as you think. It took a lot of caressing by the team to make those projects reality, or at least close to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there still needs to be some sort of incentives that are probably beyond us.
Well, Prop 123 is actually meant to be an incentive. So if you opt in, developers will know that they will be able to go after this pot of money for funding. So I would say that not opting in might have sort of the opposite effect, because it's just going to be taking away one more source that they can go after. The LIHTC is a problem. It is hard to get LIHTC funding out here. And I think that's part of the reason why the state chose to have such light penalties for not hitting your baseline. Because I think they do understand that some municipalities may not have direct control over something like this. But if you do opt into Prop 123, that is just going to be one additional source of funding that a developer can go after.
Ms. Smith?
Yeah, just to clarify, when we talked about hiring, I think we talked about 90 days with the administrative review. We talked about the ability to use some of that funding to hire that 40% for support. So is that something that we would look at doing?
So within that dollar amount, it's a very minimal dollar amount. And it's a one-time dollar amount. And so when we budget for 10-year cycles. We need to make sure that we are right-sizing our FTEs for the long term, not just a moment in time. Okay. Also, I don't necessarily think that our issue right now is necessarily manpower. It's usually related to the quality of the applications, if I can just be blunt about it. It's usually about missing information and about not having everything that you need to make a decision. So I'm less worried about the manpower aspect of it, and I'm more worried about that folks will say, you need to do this in 90 days, and that's when we start applying leverage and saying, like, you need to give us a complete application in order for us to make a solid recommendation, because we want this to be approved too. This is a good thing for our community. However, we're only going to put something in front of council in that staff can be feel secure in that they're able to provide the right technical answers so that we can retain our credibility, so that we can retain that you guys are knowing that we're reviewing it to the level that the community expects.
The other clarification I recall when we were talking about Prop 123 at first, that the loans could be forgiven. And so if a developer came, so say we opted in and then the developer applied for this loan, they could have a no interest loan or it forgiven completely if they build.
Correct.
So that would be an incentive for developers to continue to come here.
Yes.
So if we opted out, developers would go somewhere else that would get forgivable loans like that.
Correct.
Right? Okay. And then lastly, if we opt out, this money is coming out of our residents' taxpayer dollars and going to go somewhere else then?
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Smith has given a good argument for why we should opt in. Yeah, thank you both for the presentation. Very consistent with what I heard down at the Metro Mayor's Caucus. We got a presentation from DOLA on that. There are a lot of unanswered questions yet, so stay tuned. But they really, I think, strong efforts were made to make sure that the disincentives to opting in were truly minimized. And so, you know, for me personally, philosophically, I was opposed to 1, 2, 3 because I didn't like taking taper dollars that should have gone back to taxpayers, but I lost. So now that we've got it, you either take advantage of it or, as Ms. Smith has, I think, correctly pointed out, it's going to go elsewhere.
Make one last point.
One last point. I thought I made it for you. Go ahead.
I just want to give you kudos, Sam. Thanks for coming in and just really taking the lead and taking the bull by the horns and presenting to us in such a great way. So thank you.
Oh, no problem, and let me know if you have any other questions or concerns.
Very good. Thank you. Ms. Gillis, do you have anything else for us tonight? We stand adjourned. Mr. Jones, are you going to free the mobs, or are you going to?
I'll let somebody else.